Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to there's Min. Okay. Welcome to our workshop in cultural affairs. Happy to see you all. My name is Joanna Veronkovich, and I'm one of the faculty directors for the Center for Cultural Affairs. And then today we have two speakers talking about their work in one of the recent books we published on innovating institutions and inequities in the arts. So we have Jungmin Lee, who is a PhD student here at the O'Neill School. And we also have, and she wrote a great article looking at equity and grants funding over the state of Indiana using data from the Indiana Arts Commission. And we also have Michael Rushton, our faculty director emeritus now, retired, and happy to be back with us, I'm hoping. And he will be talking about his concluding chapter in the book, which I'll let him introduce and talk about, but it's really excellent. So, Min, are you prepared to get to start, or would you like to wait? How are you feeling?
I can just start now, but I just wonder whether I could share the slide that I made.
Yeah, you should be able to share the screen.
Okay. Let me try. Is
Great.
it working on your
Yeah.
side? I will try to make a full screen. Still feeling okay?
It's on presentation mode, and we can see your presentation mode. So we probably want to see just the full screen.
Let me try again. Give me 1 second. How about now?
Great. Looks great.
Okay. And yes, it's working. And yeah, thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you for also inviting me to this workshop. Very glad to be here. Nice to meeting to everyone. And you can call me Min. I'm a PhD candidate here, and I'm presenting one of the chapter in the book looking at state arts organizing grant and regional inequality. So just start with the overview of the chapter. I look at government grants in this chapter, one of the important financial sources for a lot of arts nonprofit. And when we look at the rural areas are scarce in resources. And also there's not many nonprofit that serving for those needs in the rural area, meaning that the financial instability of those rural nonprofit can be directly related to lack of access of the community to art and culture. So the problem is very noticeable, and I'm trying to looking at the effect on those inequality through the introduction of the community engagement criteria in the state's arts funding. And I did find a piece of evidence that support those relationships in the case of Indiana, but there are more policy actions and a lot of data should be collected to further looking at the comprehensive picture. But I will start with the inequality in grant distribution and consequences. So when we look at the arts and culture, it's a service and commodity that the individual have a right to access to, and the government grant funding those rural area is there to at least secure the baseline of needs and demands can be met by some nonprofits. However, when we look at the government grant allocation process, it can also be very biased. So a lot of literature cited here look at the government grants, and they found that organization size, performance management system, higher outcome, whether they have a previous history of receiving grants, have a high correlation of the likelihood of receiving grants. And when you look at those characteristics, it's one of those common characters that you can more easily find in urban nonprofit than the rural nonprofit. So that rural nonprofit often lack in those quality they look for, they might have a lower chances of getting government grants. But once again, as I said earlier, that those securing of financial sources, the stable sources, are very important for rural nonprofit because it is just one or two nonprofit that's serving those needs in the community. And when they have to close down their operation or reduce the program size because of the financial instability, it is affecting the community's like accessibility to art and culture. So the impact is much more detrimental when we look at the rural nonprofit. And then the community engagement. So When we look at the state arts funding, a lot of it are under state appropriation. So meaning that the state's art agency has to justify their spending, and the citizen participation and engagement is often a lot of time used as those base ground for justification. As a part of it, the community engagement has been introduced in most of the state arts agency that grants to nonprofits. And when we think of community engagement criteria, we might think that because the rural nonprofits, they are serving an important role for community, given that the dependency of community on those nonprofits are huge in accessing arts and culture, we can think that, okay, those are aligned and the rural nonprofit can have a benefit of introducing those criteria into the process. But there's other literature say otherwise, that it can well be the other way around, because the community engagement in this process are very much implemented in a uniform manner, and the concept that is implemented here are built based on the urban context. So a lot of time the community engagement in this process, they measure through very one-dimensional measure. For example, like total number of people engaged. It's a very straightforward measurement and also very easy to compare in the process. However, because the total number of people engaged comes from very much different things. So for example, if your regions are located and the infrastructures are very much convenient, and there are other things going around besides your nonprofit events. I mean, there are more people gonna be come to your region and you draw more people in general. But if you're in a region that is hard to access, well, then the total number of people might not be as big as the other region. However, that does not make that work in nonprofit is less of a value in terms of the community engagement. So there are different directions can been discussed in literatures, and I try to test those in the case of Indiana. So before I getting into the data, I just want to talk a bit more about how the arts and culture industry look like in Indiana. So when we look at the Indiana, there are significant numbers of self-employed artists, like around 40% of artists are self-employed. And it's a higher in terms of the proportion on average compared to US average. And when you look at the average wage of this individual, it's lower than national average. So there are some pieces of insecurity and stability in industry in Indiana. However, the demand towards art and culture are continuously growing. But it's also true that a lot of arts nonprofit in Indiana are suffering under financial difficulties. They are oftentimes lower staff, which is quite an issue for especially lower nonprofit, because they need to do a lot of outreach efforts to reaching out different people that live far across from the rural area. But the lower staff is kind of issues in that case as well. And this is a regional district that was defined by Indian Arts Commission. From here, I will refer it as IAC. So the IAC defined as regional districts, and the regional districts are basically coded with the application. So we can tag the nonprofit awardees from which regional district, and each regional district have an agency that more tailored to those applicants from that region. When we look at the regional district, when you look at Region 7, it's the most densely populated area, and it has a high employment, artistic employment. Many nonprofits working for art and culture are there compared to other regions. So there are definitely a regional inequality in terms of district-wise. And also when we look at the urban and rural experience with arts, there's a survey that done in here in Indiana where they ask a question to urban and rural community leaders how they think about art. And when you ask an urban community leader, they often associate with the tourism and entertainment, versus the rural community leaders were a lot of words that coming up from their responses were underfunded and limited. So even from those responses and a lot of resource inequality in this region, we can think of that can be an inequality in the rural and urban in Indiana, and so as based on the regional district. So the data. So I used operating supports grant from IEC from year 2018 to 2019. The total grant size vary depending on their physical situation. But an application should be registered under 501(c)(3), and they have to be under operation continuously for 2 years. Now it's 3 years, but at that point of time, it was 2 years. And the application will be evaluated by this panel peer reviewers. So they are the non-government employees, but individual specialists in this field that have at least 2 years of experience. And they look at the application and they evaluate based on this 4 criteria. So each criteria will take a 25 points. It will add up to 100 total. And the application should be higher than average 75 in order for it to be qualified for the grant. And I was able to have access to some of the data points of the grantee nonprofit between those fiscal year. Their geographic location, their total budget size, and the organization average scoring across these 4 evaluation criteria, and their awarded amount, also their outcome, which is the number of adult and children, youth, artists engaged. So I ran a basic linear regression model here where the awards amount is a dependent variable, and rurality and high community engagement score is a dummy variable, and whether they're located in the rural county are the primary independent variable in this regression. I also added an organization budget size and their population size of the county in order to control some other variation that is not necessarily about the rural nonprofit and the rurality itself. And when you look at the rurality, it's the proportion of the rural county out of total number of the county from the region. And the high community engagement score is you will get a value of 1 if the grantee organizer score higher than average compared to other grantees. And then when looking at the located in rural county, that's not the same as rurality of the regional district, because when we look at some regional district, for example, if the 70%, like 7 counties out of 10 counties are the rural counties, but there's still a 3 county that is urban. So if you are coming from that district, you can tell that they're relatively high rurality regional district that you came from. But then if the organization located in those 3 urban county, then that organization will be coded as 0 in this context because they are from urban county. So what I'm trying to do here is by giving 2 layers of regional information where about their physical location in terms of the county, but also whether they were part of the district, part of the network that is more urban or rural. So those are the independent variable that I primarily look at. This is a regression analysis. When we look at the third and fourth model, that's when I use the location of the rural county, whether the organization itself is located in rural county. I did not find statistical significance on that relationship, but I found something in when we look at the rurality of the regional district with the high community engagement score. So when we look at the first model, when I just estimate the relationship with the rurality of regional district with the awarded amount, it is positively correlated, meaning that if the nonprofits are coming from a relatively high rural regional district, you're expected to have receive more awards than when you're not. And when you look at the second model, the interaction part is interesting because the effect size is much greater than what we see in the first model, that when the nonprofits are coming from relatively high rural area and you are scoring high score in the community engagement criterion, then you will expect it to have more grants. So when I'm trying to make it a bit more tangible here with the number, so given that the nonprofits are coming from 70% of rurality, and when they receive higher than average score in community engagement, they are expected to receive 1,000 and to around $1,200 more than those nonprofit that did not receive a high score in community engagement score. So conditional on those high community engagement score, the result shows that the community engagement score can actually help the nonprofit from rural area can expect to have a higher grant amount. However, as I again said that it's a very conditional on community engagement score, it is not that all rural nonprofit are expected to have a higher grant amount. It is conditional on those community engagement score, which is making sense, but also getting a higher score in community engagement criteria, it's also coming from a lot of organization characteristic. So that if organization know how to maneuver the process well, when they know how to write better sentences in the application, there are more chances of them receiving a higher scoring. So there are still a lot of other organization characteristics that has to be discussed in this argument. And also the other part is that I only look at the grantee nonprofits, so those who got the grant. But that can also be biased in a way that we don't know the full scope of application. So that we're not sure that those who are applying to this grant is already those who are already in a bigger size, like more similar to urban nonprofit, even though they are in a rural area. So there has to be more research that has to be done on what is the application pool that we're talking about in the process. And so as in order for them to be more representative in terms of sample, I think also the action from state agency, trying to do a lot of outreach efforts, also providing extra assistance to reducing a burden and application process for those small rural nonprofit can also be matter in this context. And that will be my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Min. So just to remind everybody, we do have 2 presentations today, and so we'll go on to the next one before we open up the floor for questions and comments. But thank you so much. So next we'll have Michael. You're muted. You're muted. There you are. Oh, you're muted, Michael, still. Oh, can you hear me, Michael? Still muted.
Yeah, should I unmute? Is that
There
a
you
thing?
go. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'm old, yeah. So all right. So okay. So here comes Grandpa Simpson here. So anyway, so my paper it also looks at equality in public funding for the arts. Mine is a little bit different from Min's paper or many of the other papers in the volume in that I actually don't have data. This is very much a sort of high theory, 30,000 feet view of how we should think about the pursuit of equality through public funding of the arts. So just to clarify sort of what it is I'm after here, there's 2 ways to think about equality in public funding for the arts. And one is sort of, if you're going to do public funding, making sure that there are no unwarranted, biases or, lack of inclusivity in how grants are being made, that everything is being given a fair shot. If there are any distinctions being made, it's for a very good reason. So that's one aspect of equality, just sort of a fairness in terms of how does this funding work. The other thing is actually what I'm going to be looking at, which is sort of as a concept, should we pursue greater equality in society through arts funding? So in other words, can arts funding be an instrument for pursuing a more equal society? And that's actually what I'm more interested in. So, so let me go to the next slide. There it is. Okay, it works. So it's going to take me a while to get around to talking about the arts. I'm going to give sort of a bit of background first, and then we'll come back to it. So here is old school public finance. So this is, when I was a student. So mainstream public economics, sort of the middle of the middle, said that, okay, there ought to be a separation between policies designed to mitigate inequality and policies meant to solve market failures like spillover effects and public goods. And the line here was in the way this was taught was you can't simultaneously aim at 2 targets with one policy instruments unless they're very nicely aligned, and different policy instruments are best directed at different targets. So in this model, the consensus was that the best instrument for dealing with income inequality was a progressive, comprehensive income tax with some form of tax credits or negative tax to transfer income to people who don't. And in fact, calls for a universal basic income, which has become a big thing lately, are actually in this tradition of, let's make sure everybody's got enough money. That's the main thing we should focus on. And this is attacking sort of a general inequality. What this method of thinking said was, don't worry so much about specific goods. Don't mess with subsidies or direct provision of goods and services to attack inequality. They don't work that well. They're inefficient because the poor can, if you just give them cash, they can allocate that money to their most pressing needs. They know what they need and what they don't need. And also, direct provision of goods can often be sort of patronizing, done under the assumption that, well, the poor aren't capable of spending wisely, so we better give them very specific things to help them out. So many economists, and I would include myself in this, are opposed to food stamps. We don't think this is a very good policy for both of these reasons. It really limits how you can use that transfer, which is super inefficient. And it's also very patronizing. It's telling the poor, we don't trust you to spend your money well. So here are the things that are allowed, and here are the things that aren't allowed. In this way of thinking, we don't worry about equality in specific goods. And so, for example, the example I give on the slide here is that a government subsidy for shoes on the grounds that, well, poor people wear shoes and it would, help them to do that. We would think of that as a silly policy. We don't have a shoe policy or a Center for Shoe Affairs because it would simply distort markets. So we lose in efficiency and just give poor people money. If they have shoes they already like, they can spend the money on something else. We wouldn't do that. I'll give one example of an application of this. There was a working paper that came out from the National Bureau of Economic Research just a couple of months ago. And it was on tax subsidies for solar panels and electronic vehicles, EVs. And one of the results that they found was that, poor people aren't taking this up very much. Mostly these tax credits are going to people who are already well off. And the response in sort of the discourse was, well, that's actually okay because, it's not a policy that's designed to attack inequality. It's a policy designed to ultimately reduce carbon emissions by getting people to switch vehicles and adopt solar panels. And you can worry about inequality in other ways, like do it through a progressive income tax, just do it through there. So that is old school public finance. So here's James Tobin, nice little picture here. He was a Yale economist. My James Tobin trivia is that if you've ever read The Cane Mutiny by Herman Wouk, he was actually the model for Tobit in that book. He served in World War II. And Tobin said in this essay I really like on limiting the domain of inequality, he says, well, hang on, are we really sure about this? Are there no circumstances where we actually should be concerned with inequality in specific goods and not just income? So Tobin wanted to write and say, are we positive about this, or are there going to be exceptions? And, this is actually going to be a pretty interesting question. And so that spurred my thinking in terms of, okay, well, what are the exceptions to this? And so I've got some examples here that Tobin had, plus he spurred a lot of research on this. So there's sort of a literature that follows his paper saying, okay, when should the government, in the pursuit of mitigating inequality, go after subsidizing particular goods and services or directly providing them? Okay, so what are some examples? Well, one of the first examples is he says, well, the progressive income tax is great, but it actually brings its own distortions. It discourages work and savings. And so if you really want to have a progressive income tax, if you really want to exploit that as much as you can, you want to mitigate some of those inefficiencies. So for example, subsidizing childcare helps mitigate that distortion from distorting work effort, subsidize pensions, that helps mitigate that problem from that. Other examples, you can provide services that are needed rarely and by few, but that are very expensive. So let's think about an office of the public defender. So there's a good directly provided by government. And you could say, well, okay, if we were worried about people who got in trouble with the law, we could say, let's just transfer so much money to everybody that if they ever need a lawyer, they can afford one. But that's super poor targeting. Like, why would you do it that way, right? That would really increase the scope of transfers in not a very practical way. Why not just say, look, if you need a lawyer, you got one. Okay, we'll have a public defender's office for the people who actually need it. You can also think of more ordinary goods, but only needed by a few. So here in Bloomington, we have a couple of places where it is provided by the city to get lessons in English as a new language for adults. Okay, so not kids in school, but for adults. It'd be silly to say, well, people should just buy these things on their own. We should just make sure we have a progressive enough tax system so that if somebody needs English lessons, they can go buy them. Again, super bad targeting. Why not just provide the good directly? And then the people who actually need English as a new language can just go take those classes, right? That just seems much more efficient. I actually once wrote a paper on whether we could think of the arts like English as a new language, something that's very, very important to a small group of people, but not many other people. And so direct subsidy could be a provision for this. So I actually wrote up a paper on that. It still holds the record on my most rejected paper by journals, and I eventually gave up on it. So I'm just going to skip right over that. What are some other examples? When should the state provide goods or services to mitigate inequality? Well, sometimes, remember I said, if equality and efficiency are perfectly aligned, that works out kind of nicely. And so public health, public education, libraries seem to work that way. They have big externalities, and subsidizing them also really works to mitigate inequality. They have multiple things. So our arrows here align very, very nicely. You can see that there. Other examples. Tobin also discusses national or local emergencies. So in wartime, for example, distribution of goods to consumers must be curtailed because we need to be able to send goods to the military effort. That could spark inflation, that could spark hoarding. And so a solution might be price controls combined with rationing. So here we're going to impose equality on particular goods as a means of dealing with this emergency. It also it solves the allocation problem, and it also serves the we are all in this together messaging. Okay, so now we have a list of the sort of things where the state could pursue egalitarian goals through specific goods and services. For the most part, Tobin still concludes that simple redistribution of income is the default method. Now we can talk about arts funding, okay? The main thrust of my paper is that arts funding is not a very good instrument for pursuing the mitigation of inequalities, that it just doesn't fit into any of these categories. And it's interesting that the literature search I did well beyond Tobin, not one single paper mentioned the arts, and it's for a good reason. The subsidized arts are consumed primarily by those who are better off. And it is exceedingly difficult to make the case that an art subsidy directed specifically towards the poor, say through vouchers or a culture pass, is a better instrument than simply transferring income for effectively reducing inequalities. And so, we can look at the culture passes that various European countries did, and we could say, well, it's a transfer to everybody. Does that really mitigate inequality? Well, not really. I mean, you can say we're trying to do this because we think there's externalities for the arts. But in terms of mitigating inequalities, it's an awfully inefficient way to go about it. There are other reasons we can have for pursuing public funding of the arts, whether on welfare economics grounds of correcting market failures, of positive spillovers. Okay, so Min was talking about community engagement, and we can think there's great externalities from community engagement. You could say, okay, well, let's aim our funding towards that. We think that's a particularly important goal. You could have non-economic reasons for doing this, so more sort of perfectionist or communitarian grounds of preserving and encouraging culture beyond what people happen to think is valuable. I've actually moved in that direction myself, to be honest. But if one of those is our rationale for arts funding, then that goal should be kept in sight, and in terms of policies, design policies in terms of what would better pursue those goals. So let me just sort of give an anecdote here with the few minutes left. Suppose you had a country, a fairly rich country, and it's got a big cultural sector, but it doesn't actually have an arts council. It has no public funding for the arts, and for some reason it just never got around to it. And you have somebody working in the cabinet office, and when they check their schedule, they see they have 3 meetings coming up, and they're all from people who are going to advocate for, we ought to set up an arts council. And the first person comes in and says, well, I think we should have an arts council because there's actually all these market failures in the arts. We should really try to, subsidize the arts to correct for these, and a little bit of hand waving about what these might be. And okay, I'll take it under consideration. Second person comes in and says, well, I don't really like that economics model, but we've got to preserve some aspects of our culture. It's who we are. It's important we maintain this, even if people don't realize it or not, or don't realize the value of it. We should do that. Okay, person thinks I'll take that under consideration. Third person comes in and says, we really need an arts council because we have an unequal society, incomes are very unequal, wealth is very unequal, and this is something that can actually help us in this regard. And what I'm saying here is my advisor would say, I might buy one of the first two arguments. I don't really buy this one. Here's another trip through famous economists here. Here's Kenneth Arrow. I don't have an anecdote about Arrow. So anyway, he says, suppose it's still possible to improve aggregate welfare by subsidizing some goods that are disproportionately consumed by the well-off, even if it happens that actually ends up targeting people who are already well off. And anybody who works in higher ed has probably already come to terms with this. I mean, after all, it is kind of what we do. So it's another area there. So none of this is meant, again, to go back to my first point, that arts funding should not be scrupulous and non-discriminatory in terms of what it does fund. If you're going to do this at all, make sure it's fair. But this paper is about the goals of arts funding in the first place, and that's what we got to think about. So that was the paper I wrote for the book, and I have one coda here because this came up sort of after my chapter was written. And it concerns basic income for artists. And okay, so there's a number of these plans in New York City, in Ireland, and various other cities, some in Britain. The Springboard for the Arts does one in Minnesota. And these schemes have become quite popular, at least as pilot programs. And so given what I've already said, what can we say about these kind of programs? So consider the Irish program, for example. So participants have to show some evidence of being artists, like you have to give some proof that, yeah, I actually am an artist and not just a random person off the street. They're chosen by a lottery. They get a fixed amount of taxable income per week. Of course, you need to make it taxable. And participants, they need to keep track of their time spent, but they are not graded on that in terms of funding eligibility. So it's because it's a study, they say, okay, or one requirement of you is just keep track of what it is that you do. And so what is the policy meant to accomplish? And here I'm just going to express sort of my skepticism on these schemes. So I've listed here the Irish hoped for outcomes. And these guaranteed income policies seem to fall between stools of policies for equality and policies for subsidizing the arts. As a tool for equality, I might think a basic guaranteed income might be quite good for the poor. I could even advocate for that yes, we should actually push for that society-wide. But it's actually fairly inequitable to have it just for artists. Like it's not really dealing with inequality in society to say we're going to take this select group of people and give them a basic guaranteed income, but nobody else. So if you're going to do this at all, do it for everybody if you think that's a good way to go about this. As a tool of arts policy, if we say, okay, we'll put that aside, let's think about the actual arts outcome, it does seem kind of weak. In the past, we've always given grants based on actual potential using old school peer review. What actual outcome in terms of art is being achieved, and is this the best way to achieve this? In other words, was there an actual problem with the old way of simply funding artists based on their applications, proposals, peer review process, and what they promised to do? So, I'm open-minded on these policies, but at this point, I remain kind of dubious in terms of where they go. And that is what I have.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you,
Okay.
Mick. So remind everybody that you can just put your questions into the chat or raise your hand and I'll call on you. And we'll have a discussion for the next 25 minutes or so. So I'm going to start off, and I think this is maybe referring to both Min and Michael's papers, but seems to me that the complication arises when the policy goals are not clear. So, Michael, I think the whole premise of your paper is that it's when arts funding is used to be a strategy for solving inequalities, broadly speaking, that's when we run into trouble and when the logic doesn't work. But when we use arts funding to target creating more art, then there's some logic to that, especially if it's targeted toward the specific subpopulation that needs it. Maybe those people who are worse off and, have a harder time getting access to art. Would you agree with that statement or disagree? And I guess, and Min, I want to hear your comments on this too. And I guess, if you don't agree, then can you think about examples in practice, in policy now, where, and you've given a great one, Michael, on the guaranteed income, where the two goals are confounded, and at the end of the policy, like during the policy evaluation, we don't really know what we're trying to achieve. And I see that sort of as kind of the problem with the basic income programs. But maybe you can just sort of tell me if I'm right in figuring out, are those the two, do we have a confounding of goals in understanding the purpose of arts funding in cultural policy?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I mean, I guess I always think of any public policy in terms of, well, what is it you're actually trying to accomplish? What is it you're trying to do? And then once we've established that, well, this would be a good thing to try to accomplish, your second question is, what's our best policy instrument for helping us to get there? Okay, so we want to reduce carbon emissions. Here's a list of different policies that we think would help get us there that would be effective. Here's another list that we think actually would not be quite so good. And I think that's the way to think about this. Arts policy can do some things that no other policy can. Okay, there's no other department in government that can really try to say, we have good reasons to want more art, to support organizations. We do think there are spillovers. We do think there's something worth preserving here. Arts policy can help do it, and it's kind of the only policy that can do it. We have other policies to address inequality, and I guess my point is that are simply much better at dealing with what is the big issue on inequality, which is income, right? But that's really what you want to, have instruments that are good at that, do that, but don't confound it. And so there's one arts blogger I know who has kind of a sort of a one-note blog where he insists that, arts organizations should actually not be thinking even about art or what he calls art for art's sake. He poo-poos that, but instead should be thinking about the community's real needs, in terms of, housing or employment or income inequality or something like that. And he insists that, well, this is what, a real progressive arts organization ought to be thinking about. And I just think, well, no, that just doesn't seem very practical, because there's lots of other organizations can deal with those kinds of things. They'd be good at it. Arts organizations are really good at this other thing, and they're the only organization that's good at this other thing. Let them focus on that.
So why not expect then that the arts should be produced on the private market? Because I keep on thinking that the pressure, right, to try to solve social issues like inequality comes from the fact that many of our arts organizations are partially publicly funded. So wouldn't that be an argument for the arts to be produced primarily on the private market?
You might say that. I could not possibly. Yeah, I mean, I think you can find reasons for public funding that don't necessarily go to that. I think an interesting thing that's happened over the decades is that we actually don't, and I don't want to take up all the time here, is that we don't really have a clear sort of statement of purpose as to why we even do this at all. I think we did when these organizations were founded, and looked at when the National Endowment for the Arts was founded and say, what did they actually want to achieve there? But I think it's, like many government agencies, it's not alone, but it's that's kind of been lost in the midst of time.
Min, I want to ask.
Min, respond here.
Yeah, Min, I actually want to ask you a different question, Min, because it's something that I know we spoke about when we were talking about your essay, but you didn't really bring it up too much or emphasize it too much in this presentation. But this is this idea that these rural areas are almost being penalized for not having community engagement as a part of their strategy to get grants. Can you comment a little bit on that element, and maybe whether or not you see evidence of that in your data, in your conversations, and your understanding of the grant program in Indiana?
So I think like in general, this process do want every nonprofit to have a community engagement proportion. However, I think I agree with your comments about there being more pressure to be community engagement centered than urban nonprofit. And I think that's probably based on the expectation that rural nonprofit may not be as good in terms of other criteria. So
Mm.
like they do have organizing excellence, they have artistic quality, they have arts education is other part of the evaluation scheme. And organization excellence, well, it's about like financial stability. So it's maybe true that they might not be good at it. But the other component, they also uh, expecting that they might not well perform as urban nonprofits. So then the only other criteria that they can actually prove themselves that they're eligible for this grant is a community engagement. So it's true that they might not be treated as same way in the process, and they are feeling more pressure to selling the community engagement component than other parts. But also the irony part is like even they are under the heavy pressure of the selling a community engagement portion of their work, they're also limited in selling that part of it because the community engagement is understood in how many people engage.
Mm.
Well, then that's not fair. So I think I I agree that the rural nonprofit has to sort of like selling themselves and prove them their competency based on this criteria in this process. But I want to comment that the current process is not as fair to even prove the right way of community engagement.
Mm. It'd be interesting to see across your sample, um, you know, look at look at levels of funding and then obviously look at differing community engagement scores, but basically standardize the community engagement scores and see how levels of funding differ between urban and rural. And I know you've done that to some respect, and that's partially what your regression is doing. But I'd be curious to see what either the penalty, right? The penalty or the benefit is for including a robust community engagement strategy in your proposal would be.
Yes, and also I think like if I have more capacity, what I really want to do is like I think the detailed approach in this like the community engagement criteria is really important. Also, like what are the information they write in the application form as it is to just guarantee those level of community engagement scoring because like they probably want to see some type of community engagement activity in some way that they prefer, and if they have it they will likely have a higher score in community engagement. But if they don't hit that part, then even though they have some aspect, it might not translate it into high community engagement score. So then I think I would love to see like what are the information that makes those differences in the scoring that ended up making differences in how much they're getting a grant. So, because and that actually boiled down to another questions of like whether they know what to say in the application. It may not be exactly the way that they're doing in their field, but like what they say is also matter, and whether they have experience of knowing what to say in the application. So.
Yeah, interesting. The best data would be if you had data where community engagement wasn't part of the scoring criteria,
Mhm.
and you saw the year that it was added, and then to see what the difference would be. But obviously, you don't have those data. But it would be really fascinating to see what
Yeah,
happened.
that would be perfect because if I can see the differences of the pattern of the distribution of
Right.
the grant before and after, that would be amazing. But I didn't have
Yeah.
that.
So I have two questions in the chat, big ones. So I'm excited to hear the answers. So for Michael, do you see the purpose of public funding for the arts to differ based on the source of the funding? So for example, federal funding versus state local funding, and maybe state local funding could be more efficiently and effectively directed at serving up equity than federal funding could.
Yeah, that's a great question, Julia. Thank you. It immediately reminded me of when new President Barack Obama appointed Broadway producer Rocco Landsman to be chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. And in his very first week on the job, of course, the the press went out to interview Landsman to say, well, what are your plans for the endowment? And one of the first things he said was, well, I really want to focus on excellence. He says, there's been too much emphasis on, distributing the money really evenly across the country. And he says, look, the theaters in Chicago, like Steppenwolf, are going to be doing, much more interesting things than what you can find in Peoria. And so, of course, he then spent about the next year trying to walk back that statement, visiting Peoria multiple times because he got in so much trouble for even suggesting such a thing. And so it seemed that at least in Washington, D.C., they really want federal funding to be very evenly distributed geographically. And so in terms of his idea that, well, we should really aim at subsidizing excellence in the arts, that was just shot down right away, and never really got anywhere, and he never mentioned a word about it again, and nobody at the National Endowment for the Arts has ever mentioned it again. And I think this comes to what we found in Min's paper on state funding as well, is that at both levels, both at state and federal, you get this really big emphasis on sort of a geographical equity, that seems to be really important. Part of that is just simply political smarts. You want to make sure that every representative in Congress or in the State House has some organizations in their district that are receiving funding, because that might help get support. And this is seen as a way to do this. So in some ways, the federal and state seem to operate on fairly similar principles. Which is spread the money evenly geographically as much as we can. The NEA takes great pride in saying every single congressional district gets some money. So they don't really seem to emphasize that. Whether state and local would be better at serving up equity, again, I think we want to think about, well, what would it actually be doing? So what would it mean, say, for a local arts organization? If I thought about, say, the Bloomington Arts Council here in town, what would it mean for them to try to pursue equity? Like, how would they use their arts budget to say, well, we're going to really try to tackle inequality, and a city with a lot of inequality, how would they actually go about that? Like, what would their aim actually be? And that's a good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but at least at the state and federal level, they seem to have adopted a similar principle, which is they're not really targeting personal inequality so much as making sure that there is this geographic distribution.
So Megan has a really big question, and I would love to hear both Min and Michael have a response. So outside of providing quality art, shouldn't community engagement be another large piece of an arts organization, because the art is inherently for the community? Min, do you want to take
it? I studied like arts, like fine arts, in art school before I joined this program. And when I was artist doing a fine art, I was highly against this comment because like art is about the quality. Like you have to pursue the essence of the fine arts. That does not necessarily like many people love your art or not. So like there was one part that I learned how I learned it in art school, but then when I look into more of the policy side and studying this, I cannot fully discount that there is a great chunk of the community engagement has to be in the arts program when it comes to the grant, because we are talking about the public spending. Ultimately, the money is from the taxpayers and it goes to arts nonprofit. And when we think of that portion, I think the community engagement, it has to be dealt with the similar weight in the evaluation. But it is a really broad question to answer when it comes to quality of art in general, because I think it just comes to a lot of issues of not just the public spending, but how people even think about arts. Like, is the art that we're talking about here, is those the art that is like very high profile art, or are we talking about arts in more like a daily living basis where you can just have access to? So it's a very different variation of art, which makes this feel very interesting. But I think when it comes to grants, the part that I looked at it, it's even though we are probably going toward scheme where are we granting a money to arts nonprofit, or are we granting to community nonprofit? Sometimes we just can't really tell, because it's it's in the application, it's really hard to tell from like they do art as a primarily, but they engage community, versus I'm a community engagement, I have arts education piece in my program. Like, should that be same? It is not. But in the application, it's sometimes dealt in a very same manner. So then I think there is a questions about, are we funding arts nonprofit that does community, or are we favoring community engagement that has art? So I think there are different balance with that, but I partially agree with that comment. So
Yeah, thanks, man. And I love how you started with the perspective of when I practiced art, I would have never thought my art would have anything to do with community engagement, right? But then, so that I love that you started with that perspective. Michael, do you have a response?
Yeah, I think it's important to ask what we mean by community, which is not actually a simple thing. So let's consider, say, fairly innovative avant-garde theater and dance in New York City. What's the community for that? Like, what would we mean by community there? Well, we could say, well, people who go to performances, right? That's a part of it, sure. But I think we also know that the innovation and the ideas that get generated in such a sort of hotbed of arts activity has influence on theater and dance nationwide, even internationally, in terms of new ideas, new ways of thinking about what theater can be or dance can be, and so on. And so where you have the sort of concentration of people and concentration of arts such that it can actually support things that a local organization couldn't possibly do, then I think we need to, think about, well, what is their community? What, who are they really speaking to? What are the benefits? So, and I think Rocco Landsman, in a way, was right that there is going to be more innovation in theater and dance in New York City than in Peoria. I think that's just a fact. It's not knocking Peoria to say that. They simply don't have that concentration of artistic ideas that's going to do that and have that kind of huge influence. And so I don't think when we think about arts policy, I think it's a mistake to always think about community in terms of, well, it's the local people who go to performances. That's your community, right? The people in your town. I think community in the arts has to be thought of as something bigger than that, an arts community that goes beyond sort of local driving distance. And so I guess I just want to give that sort of warning that when we say, well, arts are always for the community, make sure we're being careful about how we define what community actually is.
Great. Other questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I don't want to be the only one speaking. So there is a little bit of a chat going on in the chat, and this is whether or not the overall goals we see from arts funders are to solve something like income inequality or equality more generally, or whether the arts funders are trying to solve inequality among in the arts. And I think my understanding is that your example of guaranteed income is one in which there are probably goals on either side. But maybe, I mean, Michael, do you have any other examples of arts funders that are using arts funding to try to tackle overall inequality issues as opposed to just inequality within the arts?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, so we can have there's an earlier comment by Julia, who says I should get to know the Indie Arts Council, where equitable distribution of funds is something we think about and practice every day. So, okay. So, I mean, we can take two approaches here, which is that actually local arts councils really think a lot about how to improve equitable outcomes through art spending, or that I'm dealing with a straw man. But we can't say both, right? So, I do think that there is a predilection to think about in arts councils. Well, we want to think about, this is an unequal society, and we should be, contributing to mitigating that. I don't think that's an invented idea.
Yeah, I think there's a confluence, and I think there's a little bit of confusion, to be honest, in a lot of the funding strategies. I think I saw Trevor's hand go up first, so go ahead, Trevor.
Hi, yeah, so this is a question for either of you. There's some evidence that, public funding for the art can actually create a crowding out effect where private donors and local people in communities say, well, I don't need to fund that organization because they're already receiving some public funds. Do you think this community development strategy or these state level arts grants rather than federal level arts grants can address that perception? Or do you think that we're just kind of putting a new spin on the same challenges?
So for like the sample that I looked at in my analysis, like their budget size, like even though we have big size nonprofit and rural area, but most of them are very in a lower budget size, meaning that there's, sadly to say this, but there's not much to be crowded out in the context of in here, because they do have like service fee very low, like because like they're putting up the show, but the revenue they earn from putting up the show is not really that significant part of their, and the donations, like they do have endowed like donations that were just like start from the founder, but they don't really have additional like very transactional like donations every cycle. So like in the context of here, it's not really that the case. However, yeah, I know I'm aware of those line of literature that look at the government grant can have a crowding out effect. But I think for the rural nonprofit that have not much choice in their revenue stream, it's more about they just get what they can get at that moment. So
Yeah, it's a good question, and I agree with Min. You are going to get real distinctions according to where you are. I mean, I think, the whole point of arts funding is that it's going to make a thing happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. Otherwise, it's wasted money, or it's purely a transfer payment. I mean, the whole point of having public funding for the arts at all is it will make this thing be there that otherwise wouldn't be there, whether an organization at all, or the scope of the things it can do, or what have you. But you do the funding because it's going to do a thing, and you have to be able to identify that thing. If it's the case that that thing you want to achieve, so making more art happen, for example, or making more access to it, if there are places where spending is going to have more impact on that because it won't lead to crowding out and will actually make a bigger difference in what kind of outcomes we get, then you could say, yeah, there is actually a rationale for saying let's do more of that. If there's other places where you are going to get big crowding, so that government finance is really not going to have much impact at all on what we actually see, if all it's going to really change is the sources of revenue, then you'd say, well, why would we emphasize that? There doesn't seem to be as much point in that.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I love these conversations. We're all about them here. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Min, for your wonderful presentations and your wonderful chapters.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Min. Thank you, everybody, for coming to listen.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for your great comments and great sort of stimulations of thought. So please do join us. We're having our last workshop in 2 weeks, where we're going to have Jamie Hand and Maura Cuffey from Creatives Rebuild New York talk about the basic income or guaranteed income program for artists in New York State. They are sunsetting at the end of this calendar year. So we are all ready and anticipating the results from the impact evaluation. So they'll be presenting on those in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.